everyone, welcome back to the Facts of Life lecture series. We're now moving into Module 11 and talking about plants. And this is a simplified phylogeny of the kingdom Plantae. And you can see here we have mapped onto this phylogeny some major transitions, some innovations that occurred in the evolution of plants that led to the development of these different groups that are now quite dominant on the planet. And so we'll be talking about plants through this lens. So to start, green algae are really the group of organisms that gave rise to plants. So they're not plants themselves, but they're a group of freshwater algae that are the closest living relatives of modern land plants. So you'll sometimes hear these called chara or charophytes. They contain chlorophyll and they're capable of photosynthesis. We talked in last week's lecture about how some bacterial cells are able to do that, and you can see some of them in these images here. Oh, sorry. They don't have vascular systems, true leaves, cuticles, or stomata. And so we're going to talk about all these innovations in this talk. So the first big innovation in the development and evolution of plant life is the cuticle. So remember, these green algae are living in the water. And so this transition to land is a major transition in the evolution of plants. But in order to live on land, there were a lot of challenges that these organisms had to overcome. Living on land led to a much higher desiccation risk, meaning they could dry out really easily. So how could the plant maintain water in its cell without being in water? It also had much higher UV exposure. So being on land and exposed to more light, how could the plant protect itself from harmful UV radiation? Of course, there's not as much motion and, passive motion that happens when you're on land compared to in water. So they had less motility. How could the plant protect itself from dirt and pathogens without passively moving along water currents? And the final big transition to get to land was the need for gas exchange. So how could plants maintain a balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide? So these are all major challenges that plants had to overcome in order to move to land. And the really cool thing is that the solution to all these problems, at least in part, was the cuticle. So the cuticle is a waxy outer layer of cells. It's hydrophobic, meaning that it doesn't like water, so you can see water beads up on the surface of plants because of it. It contains gas exchange structures right here. Those are called stomata. And it protects the plant against UV radiation and pathogens. And so we can see this in this TR is called trichomes. We can see that on the surface of these leaves. And if you guys are more interested in how gas exchange happens on the surface of leaves, these stomata and their role in protecting plants against drought is something that Dr. Shi studies in the biology department. So you can read more about her research. So the next big innovation happened when we had bryophytes. So that's mosses and liverworts. And usually when you think about moss, you think about these massive green mats of vegetation. And if you look really closely at some of these mats of green vegetation, you'll see these little stalks with a spore sac. That's also part of the moss plant, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Let me tell you a few things. So bryophytes are the least derived. Some people might call them the most primitive land plants. People who study more primitive land plants don't like the term primitive. So Bryophytes are the least derived land plants. Their life cycle includes what's called alternation of generations. That means that the gametophytic generation is dominant and the sporophytic generation is subordinate. So we'll talk about that in just a moment when I go over the life cycle. But the big thing is that unlike most plants, oh, I said that right there. And fertilization depends on water, and dispersal depends on wind. So if we want to get the sperm to the egg, we need water. If we need to get the fertilized embryo to a different location, we depend on wind. And this is the life cycle. And you can see this dividing line here that happens during fertilization. The top half of this life cycle is haploid, 1N, and the bottom half is diploid, or 2N. So we're also, as humans, we have haploid and diploid cells. Most of our cells were very much dominant diploid organisms, but our sex cells, our gametes, are haploid, just like mosses. So if we start here with that capsule, inside that capsule is spores. So the spores are haploid. They germinate into this little structure that grows until it starts to form emerging gametophytes. And what happens here is you have two separate gametophytes. A female gametophyte that has ovules and a male gametophyte that has sperm. So the female gametophyte is called an archegonium, which is really just literally means egg house. And then the male gametophyte contains these bodies called antheridium that contain the sperm. So as I said, a drop of water splashes on an antheridium, and then those sperm are transferred into the archegonium through fertilization. And you can see here that most of the plant tissue is in this part of the life cycle. We then move into the diploid part of the life cycle, where that zygote develops. It starts to grow into these stalks in capsules that once they dry out, they explosively dehisce. So they basically, the cap opens up and those spores are dispersed via wind, and the cycle begins again. So really cool organisms to check out on your walks around a forest. So the next innovation to talk about is the development of vascular tissue. And so this is a picture of a tree. And we talked about how plants are critical for their photosynthetic ability. They also need to be able to transfer water and nutrients across lots of different parts of their body. And so before there was vascular tissue, you just have these creeping plants because they can't stand up and still transport all of that, all those nutrients and water. And you can think about that as being, really true, because the force of gravity can keep that from happening unless you have specialized tissue to deal with it. And so there's two types of vascular tissue in plants. There's xylem and phloem. And xylem transports water and minerals from the roots. So the roots are going to get water and minerals, use xylem to transport it across different structures of the plant. Phloem actually transports sugars throughout the plant. So sometimes it goes from the leaves to the roots, and other times it moves in other directions. So our first vascular plant group that's really dominant is the ferns, seedless vascular plants. That includes ferns. So we have a similar life cycle here. Again, we're breaking this down into 1N and 2N. And if we start here, we have a mature sporangium. I'll tell you about where that comes from in a moment. That releases spores. When they germinate, they become these rhizoids that develop this interesting heart-shaped structure called the gametophyte that houses both archegonium and antheridium on the same body. And the archegonium and the antheridium are similar, egg versus sperm. And then when the sperm enters the egg, the fertilization occurs, and then we have these embryos that form. And so you still see this gametophyte holding on. It's almost like a fleshy part of the plant, but from that gametophyte is growing this sporophyte. So this is 1N, this is 2N. And if you turn a fern leaf, you'll see all of these spores, these little sorus. And each sporangium contains a cluster of spores that then dehisces. So if you guys are ever have a mature fern frond and you want to look at it under a microscope, if you slowly heat it up, you will see as it dries out, it will release those spores in a really fun way. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. If you have any questions, as always, you can use the discussions tab of Canvas to ask them. It will be available in my WebEx room during my office hours and via email any other time within reason. All right, thanks for your attention. Bye.